Hi, everyone. Welcome to Foresight Space Group. I'm so delighted to see so many of you here, humans and AI bots alike. I'm really delighted today to welcome Zach into our group. And Zach, you'll be interviewed by Creon. So I'm not going to waste any one of you guys' time by saying more because you guys can do that much better than I can. I just wanted to give a big shout out for everyone in this group who came to our Vision Weekend. And the last weekend, it was fantastic. I love the space track there. And we'll hopefully have another get together in Puerto Rico soon. And I will share a little bit more info about that in the chat. But for now, I will be monitoring the chat. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, you can find me in the chat and I will try to get them into the conversation. You can also raise your hand at any point, and then Creon and Beck can decide whether or not to loop you into the conversation directly. But anyway, without further ado, I want to welcome Creon and Zach to the Foresight Space Group. Please take it away.
Oh, hey, it's nice to see a bunch of old and some new faces here. Great, Chris and Ron and Mike McCullough. Anyway, Luke, look at all these people. We have a full screen and hopefully even more. Look, we got Steve. So look, Zach, I went and skimmed your book and read about you a little bit, but why don't you start with telling us a little bit about your background and then a little bit about the impetus and contents of the book?
Sure. I'm mostly known for being a cartoonist, and I also do some pop science writing and some other things. And about 5 years ago, we had a reasonably successful pop science book on emerging technology, and our editor wanted another book, and we pitched that we would do a book on the kind of future of space governance. And the editor said, "We'll take it, but you can't say governance on the cover of a book." But the view was essentially that we had gotten pretty excited about the developments in rocketry, which anyone in this universe knows has been quite dramatic and rapid. And I guess I should clarify to say, basically at SpaceX, I know there are other players, but really we're talking about SpaceX, and that a lot of stuff was coming soon. And so we thought we'd write the kind of definitive book on all the stuff that would go into turning that into settlements. And we were excited about that because it leads to a lot of questions about everything from physiology, psychology, reproduction, all the way up to like theory of war and law and economics and things. And I think we read that book with a caveat, and I'm totally open for antagonism on this. In fact, excited for it if it's available. We became rather skeptical during the process, both about the feasibility on the timescales usually talked about, meaning if you believe Elon Musk, next 20 or 30 years, 1 million people. If you multiply him by what we call an Elon Musk conversion factor, maybe that puts you at 50 years. But even those timelines are a bit worrisome depending on the paths that are taken now. We also became a little more concerned about some of the overall desirability having to do with geopolitical aspects in the case of, like, you get into the nature of space law and what we're concerned about. And then the long-term future having to do with the concept of war between gravity wells. And in general, concerned that a lot of the space community was basically ignoring as an example, if you read the sort of seminal book in this universe is Robert Zubrin's The Case for Mars. He does not like us very much, and I could get into why, but he's a good scientist. But I will say it's 400 pages. He never mentions the existence of the Outer Space Treaty. Not once, not in 3 editions. And, we felt like that was lacking from the discourse. So a lot of what we talk about is this stuff really exists. And as an example, there's a big difference between, does China have a space settlement versus does the US have one from a geopolitical standpoint? And we felt that was underexplored. So a decent amount of the book is spent on just developing knowledge of international law and how states actually come into existence in the modern world and that kind of thing.
That sounds, just a minute, if I may interrupt.
Yeah.
That sounds like quite a pivot for a cartoonist. Is this something in your background from before you were a cartoonist that primed you for all this?
So I'm married to a scientist who's an actual research scientist. She's in the biosciences department at Rice University. I think she already knew how to do research, and I got reasonably good at it during our last book. And I didn't think I could plead credentials. All I could say is, if you read our bibliography, I've read enough books to justify a position, I think. But I would say if you read my cartoons, they're fairly nerdy and in-depth. Like, I have a whole graphic novel on immigration policy I wrote with an economist. I'm working on some stuff on computing. I'm a little bit in both of these universes.
Great. So you mentioned Zubrin before. Yes. I got a chance to. That's very good to know that you've studied with the master, quote unquote. And we've had Robert Zubrin, it was some time ago, but he was one of our most popular speakers at this meetup. And I'm wondering if you might perhaps reanimate or revisit Zubrin's theses and your theses and talk about where they, a little more detail about where they are similar and where they're different.
Sure. Is it worth, like, Zubrin has multiple books and the famous one is 400 pages, so I don't know if I want to rehearse
I think
the
we
whole
can
thing.
stick to the case for Mars for now.
Sure.
Or he has that other one. He has a semi-fictional book about life on Mars, which is interesting because it's a reboot of Werner von Braun's semi-fictional book about life on Mars, which I'm sure.
Yes, from the 50s. Sure. So I think the case for Mars, if I recall correctly, mostly is about the idea of a near-term mission as cheaply and efficiently as possible. But I think in the back of it, he gets into the kind of like philosophy of why we should do this. And so let me take those separately. I would say most of where we diverge from him on the mission stuff is that, and I actually don't think this is that controversial even in this community, is that he's quite optimistic about cost and survivability. But I actually I don't know that we disagree with any of like his science. I think his science is quite thorough and robust. It's just a matter of, I think he thinks we can do it for 30 billion, I believe is the number in his latest edition. Maybe he's right about that. I'm skeptical that it can be done soon. I think believes it can be done very soon. Part of why we are skeptical is we're much more concerned than he is about the available physiological data. So as an example, and again, totally worth reading his book. I don't want to put anyone off it. He has a section though on like concerns about radiation, a very frequent concern in the context of space. NASA just released a year or two ago, released a 150-page document saying what we know. And what we know, it's a big shrug. It's a pretty open question. For people who don't know, only something like, the numbers are going up a bit more now, but it's 750 people have been to space, and most of them quite briefly. Like if you want to count the Blue Origin trips, very briefly, but if you want to count the shuttle, that's like a week or two. Even the moon missions are quite short. The long-term data mostly comes from the old Soviet stations in the ISS. The longest stay ever is Polyakov, which was 437 days. I think the longest total numbers are in the 800s, which would have all been Russians. Very little of that data is on women. I think about 1/7, 1/8 of all people to space have been women. Most bodies we know about are middle-aged men. And the data looks pretty mediocre. And maybe this would be worth getting into later, since I want to talk about Zubrin for now. But so as an example, in the radiation section, he has a section on hormesis, which is this idea that moderate exposure to certain bad things actually results in good stuff. And that's true. But there's at least some evidence that space doses of radiation increase risk of cancer. It's not like something dramatic. You don't die instantly in space unless you get hit by a solar flare, which is unlikely. But it is a serious problem that gets elided. In addition, we don't know the effect. So if you go to Mars, unless you're using an unusual trajectory, you have to be there for a year. We don't know the effect of 38% Earth's gravity on a human body for a year. We know in microgravity, you lose bone density extremely fast. The astronauts on the ISS who spend like hours a day exercising lose about 1% bone density per month in the hip. We don't know the effect on Mars. Maybe it's fine. We don't know. So concerns like these, we think need to be resolved before you start saying, we'll just send some people. Mind you, I'm not opposed to people who want to sign a waiver and be adventurous, but this is the second part, is when we talk about settlements, a lot of these problems are much more serious. So if you read the back of Zubrin's book, he has a whole thing about what's called the Turner thesis. And I don't want to go on a huge off-ramp on this, but it's this idea that he's explicitly devoted to. It's all over the space literature, sometimes name-checked in particular, sometimes implicit. Zubrin names it specifically. It's this idea that comes from Frederick Jackson Turner, a historian of the American West, who believed that essentially all good values in American culture come from the expansion westward, from the period of European settlers, if you like, taming the West. It's not a theory of history that's believed by mainstream historians anymore. And it's lest you think it's because historians are all like pearl clutching leftists. Like, it has been out of the mainstream since the 70s, and for good reason, right? There are claims it makes such that, and I have a whole essay on this in Foreign Policy that's 8,000 words, but just to give one example, there's this idea in Turnerism that the federal government was not really present in the West, and that's why things got wild and adventurous and creative, when in fact, most federal government spending was in the West during the period, because you can't run a long-term series of genocides by the army without spending on people, forts, infrastructure, that sort of thing. And not to mention the transcontinental railroad, etc. So some claims are just simply wrong in Turnerism. And not to mention distasteful. Turner specifically says part of why his thesis works is because white men had to organize to defeat what we now call indigenous people. He would have called Indians.
He would have called savage.
In his speeches, he says Indians. He might have said savage too. But the point to my mind is, like, in addition to being like obviously repulsive, it's also not going to be true in space. So how can we depend on this thesis to make space work a certain way if it relies on stuff that won't be true in space?
Well, okay, but let me chime in
Yeah.
first here, not to go onto an off ramp, as you said, but
Yeah.
the people would consider that a feature, not a bug, right? It's, oh, there are no Native Americans on Mars, so that makes it ethically less problematic in many ways.
I totally agree. I think there's a strain of thought that says this is just colonialism because it's space colonies. I think there are less stupid versions of that, but I think a lot of them are just saying it's colony, so it's colonialism. But I agree. Yeah, I think basically negating the fact that people are having their land appropriated and being murdered negates a lot of the ethical downsides, or really oughta. I don't see how you can argue otherwise. What I would say, though, is if you're relying on this process to produce all these salutary goods and you're ignoring how the West actually was, then it's a bad model. So meaning, and the reason this is important is because arguments like these are used to justify some sort of urgency. So I believe Dr. Zubrin would say, look, society is getting more bureaucratized, more generally sissy and homogenized. And so we need a frontier to produce all this stuff. What I'm saying is the evidence is it's not obvious the frontier produced this stuff. So as another example, Turnerism argues we have American style democracy because of these frontier people. American democracy, Patricia Limerick writes about this. She's a MacArthur fellow historian, about how that democracy was designed by like guys in powdered wigs living in palaces on the East Coast. It was not designed by frontiersmen, this sort of thing. So I just think it's a bad model. And so I say this mostly because you asked where we diverge from Zubrin, and I think this is a big place where he'd be yelling at us by now.
Okay, but nevertheless, I presume there are some overlaps where you do agree with Zubrin. Perhaps you could touch on those.
Sure. I think we broadly agree on, I think I'll give you an example. So we both agree that helium-3 is bogus. I think he's pretty good about saying some of the economic arguments are questionable. So one of our big deals is people think we have to go to space for resources to get rich. We cite data from the World Bank that if you use their numbers for like how much human wealth is bound up in resources, it's about 2.5% of all human wealth is bound up in resources. And actually about 90% of that is fossil fuels, which, unless something very surprising awaits us on Mars, is not there. Human wealth is about ideas. We get a lot more wealth out of having San Francisco, where lattes cost $8.
Even the fossil fuels were on Mars. We couldn't burn them.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. 100%. I think we basically agree on this. I will say, I think in maybe the second edition of The Case for Mars, he argued that Mars was plentiful in deuterium, which I think is not a great argument for doing anything on Mars unless the price is insanely low. But I think he's been pretty good on that by my lights. And like I say, his science for like mission design is very good. And I will even say I was kvetching about some of the stuff he said in private to an old crusty NASA guy who said, basically agreed with me, but said we could really use more Robert Zubrins at NASA, like more sort of visionary, push the boundary types. And I wouldn't want to take that away from him. I just think there's a lot that gets left out that's really important.
By the way, there's another thread to this tapestry that you and the audience may or may not be aware of, which is the connection between Robert Zubrin and Elon Musk and the connection of Mars Direct, or the Case for Mars, to Starship.
Yes.
Do you have anything to say about that? I have an anecdote about that if people want to take the time.
I'd love to hear the anecdote. I don't think I have anything that would be insightful for this group about that.
The anecdote was about 10 years ago, or maybe even a little bit longer, when the landing was happening for the first one of the big rovers that's on Mars right now. Zubrin and Elon and a bunch of us for the Mars Society were all down at JPL to watch the 7 or 9 minutes of terror or whatever it was and all that stuff. And Robert Zubrin gave a talk, and he talked about when he had been in, I guess it might have even been the Bay Area, maybe it was LA, and this person, Elon Musk, had come to one of the Mars Society meetings, this young kid who was trying to send a greenhouse to Mars and was trying to buy a ride on a Soviet rocket, and was starting to think that maybe he should build his own rocket because the Russian rockets were not only too expensive, but it wasn't even clear what the prices were. I'm sure Steve knows all this. And then he and Elon stayed up, I think, almost literally all night talking about Mars, and Bob briefed Elon on Mars Direct and all this stuff. And then Elon wrote a reasonably large check at the time for the Mars Society. And then eventually what you have is, I think with Bob Zubrin's prompting, Elon goes full in on building his own rockets, starting with the Falcon 1 and with Mars as the end goal, and adopts in large part the Mars Direct mission architecture for his vision. That's the anecdote.
Yeah, I think in particular the idea of filling up with methane on the surface.
Right.
That seems to be a big part of the mission. Yeah, that's actually the story about the greenhouse is the one I use whenever people are like, Musk doesn't actually care about space. It's all a grift. It's very hard to argue that when you know what came before.
Right. Okay. You, though, said, and this is just surprising to me because although I haven't read your book in detail, I was reading about it and reading reviews and reading the beginning. It sounds when you, and I hate to be this guy, but when you haven't actually read the whole book,
Yes.
it sounds like it's put forth as a city on Mars. It's amazing. It's going to be wonderful. It's within our grasp. But it sounds like you say, and probably right in the bulk of the book, that hold on, not so fast. So aside from radiation and micro, which are indeed serious issues, both for transit and for living on the planet, what are some other reasons that you think that we might be a little bit over exuberant, or some people might be so unrealistic?
Yeah. Let me give you my two big ones. But first of all, let me say that there's no part of me that's opposed to having something like a South Pole station set up on Mars if that could be pulled off, and which would be obviously enormous risk to the people doing it. But astronauts know what they're doing, and I don't think you'd have trouble getting competent people to sign up for something like that. And yeah, all for it. When we talk about settlements, though, the sine qua non of settlement is human reproduction, right? Because the alternative is you have to do immigration, which is like tens of millions of miles per immigrant, not to mention their supplies for 6 months is non-trivial. You'd rather make babies on site if you could. And the question that we got into is, what do we know about this? And the answer is not much. And that there's a lot of reason to be concerned. So just to go down the line, let me first say, maybe you've heard otherwise. I read everywhere, talked to people. Has anyone ever had sex in space? I say no. We don't know for sure, but the best evidence is no. There's some like interesting anecdotes, but they all don't seem to bear up under evidence.
And sex and conception are not the same thing.
Totally. We like to start with sex. So yeah, can you conceive in space? That's a trickier question. Excuse me. What I like to say is people often think that space stations are a kind of organized process of experiments, and they're just not. They're mostly put up for political reasons, and then experiments get loaded onto them of all sorts of types. And so when you look at the data on reproduction, we have this like zany grab bag, this like Noah's Ark of creatures that are not steadied in a long-term way.
Look, hey, wait a minute. Zubrin has entered the room, so that's nice.
He just arrived.
So in terms of reproduction,
his ears were burning.
Yeah, yes, no doubt. In terms of reproduction, the data is quite limited. We sent quail eggs, Medaka fish have gone, geckos have gone. One of my favorite anecdotes is Barry Goldwater was in favor of sending bull semen to space. I don't think it went. But so like a variety of creatures have gone. We've had a few vertebrates, but nothing beyond rats. And there have been some that gone fine. In other cases, not so good. Oh, yeah.
Question. When you say we've had a few vertebrates, we've had a fair number of rats, but do you mean we've had vertebrates conceive and give birth in space or not?
No, I don't. I think there was one experiment. I have to go through we have a pile of notes on this. I believe there's one where they were impregnated in space and then came back to give birth. And that, I'm digging a little deep here, but I believe this is the same experiment. They had problems having to do with birth contractions. And so one guess is maybe muscle atrophication due to microgravity caused that. There's other sort of equivocal stuff, like, so there's an example that I think female rats stopped their ovulation going to space, and it was thought that some mysterious cause was behind that. It just turns out it was probably stress induced, and if you leave them up long enough, they do cycle. But I guess the concern we have is, one, there's not a lot of data, and there's not a lot of push to get that data. I suspect because there's not much profit for billionaires, and there's not much. Agencies tend to be squeamish about sex, I think, for reasonable reasons, because no one wants to get hauled before Congress and explain about the sex project on the ISS. But there's not a lot of spend on it. If you want to read more, April Ronca at NASA does some good work on this, but there's not a lot of spend. And I think what worries us is if all the physiological effects we know about being in space for a short period, right, having to do with bone loss, having to do with muscle loss, there's a damage to the eyes for reasons that are not perfectly well understood. We really have no idea what this would do to a developing body. It's extra concerning on Mars, where you have the perchlorates in the dust, which affect thyroid hormones. And we don't know what long-term exposure has, what the effect of long-term exposure is. Likely on Mars, you're living underground to protect you from a lot of this stuff. We don't know what effects that's going to come with. And one of the things we worry about there is, as no doubt you all know, on the ISS, they have a very different atmosphere. from what we have on Earth. It's much more high in carbon dioxide and likely in trace chemicals that we don't worry about as much. And as I said earlier, most of our data is from the bodies of middle-aged men. And
Question on that, by the way,
yeah.
Side question. I suspect we don't have any child conception and childbirth going on at the South Pole Station or on submarines with their high CO2s. It seems like A, that's interesting, and B, there's things we could do on Earth before we get all wrapped up in this problem. And then C, which maybe you can address, okay, so we're not going to be having babies on Mars right away, but that doesn't mean we can't go and stay.
Totally. No, actually, a slight correction. We have had babies in Antarctica. I don't think any at South Pole Station, but we actually talk about this because it comes up in the context of international legal claims in Antarctica. Both Chile and Argentina have sent women explicitly to have babies in Antarctica as part of a territorial claim process. There's no reason to doubt that you could do it in Antarctica. There's really no big difference. Whereas submarines would be a lot more interesting. Submarines have a rate of CO2, presumably other chemicals at a rate like the ISS, I believe. We actually did a decent amount of looking into submarines and for the psychiatric aspects. But where it hits the fan for me with reproduction, right? So I assume we have all these problems. I think it's quite plausible, and different people can have different priors about this. It's quite plausible you're going to have a higher than normal rate of kids born with problems, right? And so when you snap that to the second big issue that is not getting a lot of spend, which is we don't have a lot of data on how to create closed loop ecological systems. But one thing we do know from them, if you believe the data from Biosphere 2, is that most of people's time is spent just surviving, right? And in the case of Biosphere 2, they had the Arizona sun and grid power. So you're talking about a world where you introduce a lot of kids who may have problems into a world where there's not a lot of room to take care of them. If you do have this higher than normal rate of reproductive abnormality, what's especially concerning to me, we found 3 different instances where people who work in this field, some of them are fairly prominent, said some version of natural selection will have to take its course. One author who quoted the book said, we will have to change our definition of what counts as valuable life. And maybe someone here disagrees. To me, that's like obviously monstrous that you're going to create this environment where we'll have to let evolution take its course on children who can't produce as well. It seems to me, especially whereas we consider, I think correctly, a Mars settlement as an aspirational goal, why would we start in conditions that would produce like these horrible ethical conundrums? So that's my big concern on reproduction. We both lack the data, and there's prima facie reasons to be concerned that there could be bad effects.
Okay, but we can route around that, and we can just say, fine, let's not assume that we can have a burgeoning overpopulation on Mars. Let's talk about what can be done and what should be done, what we'd like, given we just send adults.
Totally, 100%. Yeah. So I can get, and then that leads nicely to the next big barrier, which is a little less uncomfortable, which is closed loop ecology. I'll do a very brief potted history of what we know about closed loop ecologies. So for people that closed loop is you have a sealed or partially sealed container in which you try to provide as much as you can in terms of consumables for the people inside, right? An ideal one would be a completely sealed system in which people grow all of their food, have clean water, and get complete nutrition, and not to mention air. The first experiments on this come in the 60s. You can go a little earlier if you want to count other stuff, but really it's in the 60s in the Soviet Union. There's the BIOS experiments. There's a series of experiments to partially close the system. Interestingly, on the first one, they tried to run it off algae on chlorella. And I guess chlorella is just very good at making protein, fat, and oxygen. So it's in theory good, but it was a kind of very Soviet program, which was the assumption was the good people inside would be happy subsisting on chlorella, which they were not. Subsequent experiments added other vegetables. This has been a consistent finding in lots of space settings that people want food diversity. I'm sorry, I'm going to get a glass of water. I'm talking too much.
Wait a second. I just want to say something.
Yes.
Bob Zubrin has been, as well as others, have been posting in the chat, which you might want to open if you don't have it.
Please, yeah.
And I don't want, Bob, I'd like to, since you're a prior speaker and writer on this topic for many years, I'd like to give Bob maybe a chance when he feels optimal to come in and I don't exactly debate, but just have some counterpoint with you. I don't want you to take over because this is Zach's show, but I know you got things to say. Maybe we can, at some point in the near future, open the floor to Bob.
Happy to. Okay, BIOS, a big downside of BIOS from our perspective is it's small and they never completely closed the loop. We found this great quote from a paper from the 90s where the phrase used by one of the people in it was Siberians must have their meat. So meat is not very good in closed loop ecologies because you're essentially like, if you convert soybeans to cow, you have lost a lot of calories out of the system, right? We get to the really big experiment, which happens in the 90s, which is funny. I'm finding like anyone under 30 doesn't know this reference, which is Biosphere 2. And Biosphere 2, just briefly, it's an experiment done in Arizona. It's basically a greenhouse that's 3.14 acres. They claimed sealed as tightly as the space shuttle, which means not perfectly sealed, but pretty darn close. It had 8 human beings inside for 2 years. And the theory was they would make all their food, oxygen, etc.
And it was open to sunlight, electrical power, and information.
That's very well said, yes. And so worth noting briefly that there was also a lot of weird stuff with Biosphere because the people who ran it were like half artists, half engineers. So as an example, I think today we would say the whole thing should be intensive ag. I believe theirs was like 1/6 intensive ag, and then they had like biomes. They had like ghost forest and a coral reef and this and that. I think by the end they were slowly converting those to more ag. So they made a lot of choices that you would have fixed in the second round, but unfortunately, due to fights between management, and I think partially because it was just proving like the billionaire who invested a lot of money in it was promised there'd be patents, and there weren't a lot of patents coming out, and so it fell apart during the second run. And there's other stuff, like by the end, they were going pretty hungry. I think the data was the men had lost 18% of body weight. The women, it was like 10%. At one point, they were suffocating. As I recall, it was because there was concrete leaching CO2 out of the system, which sounds good until you realize that means O2 is also going out of the system. So they actually had to pipe in O2 at one point, which obviously would not be an option on Mars. And in addition, they were fighting with each other. They actually split into 2 groups, I think before a year in, who didn't talk to each other. That said, we're like on the positive end on Biosphere. It's very easy to make fun of a lot of stuff that happened there, but 8 people went in and 8 people came out, and a lot of the problems could have been fixed fairly trivially in a second run. So as an example, they had mango trees and avocado trees that just were not fruiting on the first run because it had been crushed, and that's a huge calorie source. So they were eating green bananas for a lot of their calories. And I'm like looking at the questions. Maybe I should wait on that till the end, or
Okay,
till,
look, let's go into one more
Yeah.
one more thread of the tapestry, and then maybe open it up, starting with Bob
Yeah.
and Steve or whoever really. But let's start with Bob after this. So there's another aspect which is important, I think, and that is the why. And yes, we can have scientific reasons why, and we can have soft power reasons why, and we can have aspirational reasons why. But in order to make people really a multi-planetary species and have it more than just a South Pole station kind of thing, there's going to have to be some economic aspects to this. And I wonder if you might talk about this for a little while, if you think there are any ways that this thing can close economically eventually, and if so, what they would be, or if not, how it would work if there isn't an economic closure to the project.
Yeah. So I would admit that I'm fairly skeptical on the economics. I do think where it gets complicated, where I'd be willing to give some ground, is if you have someone like Elon. Recently, Neil deGrasse Tyson was getting a lot of smack in the space community because he said he thought there was no money in doing Mars. And I believe Mr. Musk specifically said, I know that's why I'm racking up money to do this, because there is not like an obvious economic case. It is an aspirational future of humanity case. So I would say, I think the economical case, like I would say basically Tyson was right. I think there's not an obvious VC case for Mars. It's not obviously a good economic investment in the sense of you put money in, you get money out by sending an expedition, in the same way that the Dutch East India Company or the English East India Company, or that, for that matter, the conquistadors, were a good investment for the people who got sent. I do think if you snap your fingers and there are 1 million people on Mars, all sorts of economic situations are different now, right? Water is probably quite a bit more valuable if you're on Mars. It's fairly easy to get on Mars, but you do have to cleanse it. There's going to be work to do. So there will be things like that where if you had the settlement pre-existing, then the economics would change. But I don't think there's a good case for doing it on pure economic grounds as is.
All right. Thanks for the survey. Is there any last thing you want to say before we start firing missiles or whatever?
No, fire away. I would say we've talked a lot about this, the science and feasibility, and a little about the economics. A lot of our book is on international law. My impression is a lot of people who think we're wrong think international law is just dead and doesn't do anything. But I would be happy to at least talk about it. If
Okay,
people are interested.
let's have you end on that then. And this is what I mean. Could you briefly go over some of the international law theses in your book, how it helps and how it hurts?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll try to go quickly. The main document governing space is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. For the purposes of settlement, the most interesting part is Article 2. Article 2 says no sovereignty in space. Sovereignty is an idea that whole books are written about, but the basic notion is more or less what you think of as a nation state. So like an entity that is the sole government over an area, that possesses territorial extension, that regulates what goes in and out, and importantly, that everybody else agrees to this, or everybody who has power agrees to this anyway. No sovereignty in space, that means no space nations, no, as Newt Gingrich once argued for, no claiming the moon as a U.S. territory. But perversely, the interpretation that has developed since the 60s is that resources can be taken ad libitum. That is, that weirdly, you can not claim any chunk of the moon, except you could grind up a whole chunk of it, boost it to space, call it your spaceship, and that would be yours. That's like a goofy scenario, but you see how it's silly. So there were a couple documents after that kind of pertain to like aspects of the Outer Space Treaty, like the Viability Convention and two others, but they're just elaborations. There was a big push in the late 70s to have something called the Moon Agreement. The Moon Agreement would have at least somewhat clarified how the legality of resources would have worked and basically made it more bureaucratic, more controlled either by the UN or some international body. It was rejected by both the US and the Soviet Union. And which we joke about because it was rejected by the U.S. for being a little too socialist, but the Soviets rejected it as well. And probably the answer is space powers don't want to give up something they might find useful to like countries like. I should not look at the comments while I'm talking. But so anyway, the argument that resources can be claimed at liberty it seems to be becoming the norm. It's basically instantiated in the Artemis Accords under the Space Act of 2015. Obama approved it. Trump approved it via an executive order in 2020 that I believe specifically said, in so many words, hell with the Moon Agreement. So this has not been resolved, and what we're moving towards is essentially a regime where no sovereignty, but you can take resources all you want. And under Artemis, you can even designate what's called a safety zone, which is not a sovereignty claim. It's a kind of ambiguous claim, including the size of the claim, but it's saying essentially you can have a base and there's a perimeter around it where we would like other people not to like land or do stuff that might mess up our experiments, and where their safety can't be guaranteed, which is not a territorial claim. It is a kind of turf. And so how that plays out if we do get some kind of lurch for the moon is a tough question. And then one last little thing on that, which I think is notable, is often when we talk about, say, putting territory or putting bases on the moon, we talk as if the moon is homogeneous. And from a utility standpoint, it really is not. The most useful parts of the moon are on the poles, and then arguably in the lava tubes. Lava tubes, because they're like at least in theory, a kind of instant large shelter that just needs to be sealed. So potentially gives you a jump on the competition if there is some kind of competition to put people on the moon. In addition, the poles have the only sources of water in the form of ice. And they happen to be right next to the peaks of eternal light, the places where you get light. I think at the best spots have something like light 94% of the time. And but if you, depending on what numbers you want to use, if you count those areas of the poles, the total area is on the order of, we estimated something like 1,000 acres. It's quite small. That bears into this question of being able to make quasi-territorial claims when the good.
Okay, well, let's not get too down the moon versus Mars rabbit hole. I want to open first to Bob. Yeah. He had stuff about, he had technical criticisms or counterpoints about closed ecosystems and about oxygen. And then he had some questions about conception and birth issues. And then he had legal issues. So Bob, take it away. Muted.
All right, go. Okay, by the way, I wrote a review of this book, which I recently reposted on Twitter, and I'd like to post it to this chat. People can read it. But look, my basic problem with this book is it is self-contradictory and dishonest. That is, the book, first of all, you go through this long thing about how it is impossible to settle space and pointless to settle space. There's no economic gains to be had, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And then you say, therefore, it must be banned, okay, because otherwise it's going to set off a space race that will set nations against each other and cause war. And so this is a self-contradictory argument, because if there is no point and it is impossible to settle space, then obviously there's no need to ban it. Okay. The fact that you are incapable of finding solutions to the various problems that you mentioned, the various technical problems, does not mean that no one else can. And in fact, many of the problems that you identify have already been solved by many people, but you choose to ignore that. However, that's not the real thing here. The real problem with your book is the punchline, which is you say you're for the Moon Treaty, which is, as you correctly say, hands off space, period, full stop. That is, you would prevent anyone else from solving the problems that you name. Furthermore, okay, you raise the specter, okay, of this nonsense from David Dudney about how the space people are going to hurl asteroids at the Earth and wipe us out. That is, there aren't dangerous space aliens now, but there will be once we settle space. Okay, or the nations of the Earth will avail themselves of asteroids to throw at each other. Now, I am an aerospace engineer. I've had a lot of contact with the military over the course of my career, and I can tell you what the military looks for in a weapon. They look for readiness. They look for precision. They look for security. That is, an asteroid that takes years to reach its target, okay, is not a ready weapon, okay? And the people who launched it would be wiped out long before the asteroid arrived by an intercontinental ballistic missile strike, okay? That it has no stealth either, okay? It's obvious. It has no security because if you set this thing moving towards the Earth, someone could go out there and redirect it just a little bit, and it will hit your country instead of their country. And it lacks precision. So as a weapon, it is ridiculous. And this thing is just being used as a scare tactic to justify banning people from space. Okay. Now, if people want to go to war, they have plenty of causes to go to war, or perceived causes, right here on Earth. And it won't be for the control of the lunar lava tube. Okay, we've got 2 shooting wars going on Earth right now. And we had shooting wars going on in big time in the 20th century. And looking at the 20th century, okay, you can say actually that the main thing that drove those 2 wars it certainly wasn't a fight over lunar bases. It was a fight caused by a conceit that there's only so much to go around. And therefore, the nations of the Earth are engaged in a struggle for existence over limited resources. Now, by banning humanity from space, you act to perpetuate that fatal conceit. Okay, that is, if we have a world war, okay, in the 21st century, it'll be because that the national security elites of the contending powers will look at the world and they'll say, there's only so much here. I happen to know people in high-level positions in the American national security establishment who believe that war with China is inevitable because there's only so much oil in the world. And there's obviously people in China who think exactly like they do. And if this is how people are allowed to think, we are going to have another world war. Okay, the way we can defuse this is by destroying this Malthusian conceit. And there's no better way to do that than by opening the space frontier. Your book, is self-contradictory. Okay, you make no effort to find the technical solutions to the problems you raise. You're just raising the problems, like here in this thing. We don't know if people can be born, quote, in space. Okay, when you're talking about zero gravity, when we can provide artificial gravity in space, et cetera, et cetera. This is like saying, we don't know the Lewis and Clark expedition will succeed. In fact, there's all these things that we could name of why it would fail, and therefore it can't be launched. The Indians could wipe it out. The Spaniards could wipe it out. They could catch a disease. They could be caught in a blizzard. You name it. Okay, there's any number of reasons why you couldn't know in advance that the Lewis and Clark expedition would succeed and why you could claim that it must fail. Okay, but the worst thing that could have been done was for someone to say, and therefore we are banning explorers from going out and seeing what they can do. And that's what your book does. You want to ban people from going out to the space frontier. You raise potential risks, and therefore you say, therefore it should be banned, as opposed to letting people take their own chances and trying to find the solutions.
Okay, thanks, Bob. That's great. Do you have something to say, Zach? Do you want to? I think this is one for the books. Zubrin versus Zach. And
And by the way, I have challenged the Weinersmiths to a formal debate, and initially they it showed some interest, but they declined. But my challenge still stands. I am
so here we are
having in a formal Oxford Rules debate with the Weinersmiths.
Well, we're having it. Here we have a informal prelude to that. What do you want to say, Zach? You're muted.
Zach, I muted you earlier just because of the tippling of the computer sound, but feel free to unmute anytime. You should be able to.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, great. Thank you to Dr. Zubrin for that thorough response. And I want to just start by saying I really agreed with an article Dr. Zubrin wrote arguing that we should be open to immigration of Russian engineers trying to flee that regime. I think we're both very pro that. Let me just go down the line of where I disagreed with the criticisms. And I'll try to go quickly because I think I'm out of here in 10 minutes. So I'll do my best here. So one, I don't think it's internally contradictory to say that something is hard and could also lead to trouble between nations because nations fight for stupid reasons. So I think you could argue, for example, that the initial space race was not actually a good indicator of which country was on the path to power, right? So this whole time there was a fight about who has the best rockets. The US had the best microtechnology. There's a great account by Asif Siddiqui called The Rocket's Red Glare, where he argues that the only reason the Soviets had the advantage in being able to boost Laika and Belka and Strelka and then Yuri Gagarin is because they couldn't miniaturize their bombs. So they just had these huge pointless boosters. So the US was ahead from the beginning, and yet we got into this crazy space race. Let's see. You repeatedly said we argue for banning space access, and we just don't. I don't know where that comes from. What we specifically argued for
the Moon Treaty.
Sorry?
The Moon Treaty, which, as you point out, essentially bans human activity on extraterrestrial bodies.
First of all, we don't argue for the Moon Treaty. We argue for a treaty model on UNCLOS.
Oh, you argue for the Moon Treaty. That's in the book.
We talk about the Moon Treaty, but we specifically argue for a program based on law of the sea, on the seabed.
Okay, let's leave
we'll
that.
Take your word for it, Zach.
Yeah.
Any other comments?
Let's keep going.
Okay, great. I would also say, though, it's not obvious that the Moon Treaty bans activity. I'm not sure quite what that means in this context. The Moon Treaty would have set up an international body that would have regulated behavior. But if you look at what happened with UNCLOS, which is signed into law in 1994, corporations are allowed to do stuff. They just have to go through a process. China right now is doing some exploration for these polymetallic nodules on the ocean floor. So maybe we just have different senses of what is meant by the word ban. I believe you would be correct to say it would slow things down. That's probably the case. But I don't know what you mean when you say we're arguing for an outright ban. I'm just going through my notes here. So you say we're incapable because we are incapable of solving problems. Therefore, we just object to everything. We actually end the book with a roadmap for the problems we would like to be solved if we could get the funding for it. As to the reproduction question, our roadmap is we think it should be tried in closed loop ecologies on Earth, then try moving it to the moon. We literally just provide a roadmap for what we think would solve the problem. The same thing with closed loop ecologies. If it were up to me and I was tasked with getting Mars settlement on, this would be a big point of spend. For a few $1 billion, you could get a couple dozen biospheres or a bunch of smaller facilities. You could get a lot of science on these ecological facilities. I don't know what you mean when we say we're just raising problems and not providing solutions. We're trying to talk about why the solutions are very hard.
Okay, let me cut in because I know the clock's running out.
Yeah.
Two things I'd like to ask Bob. Do you have anything specific to say about reproduction on the moon and closed loop ecologies beyond what was in the chat?
Okay. The issue of whether humans and other higher animals can reproduce correctly in partial gravity remains to be settled. The Mars Society in 2000 put forward the idea of what we call the Translife mission, which was to orbit a capsule that would spin with Martian gravity and put a crew of mice in it for 60 days, which would allow them to have children and the children grow to maturity. And then we could recover them and see how they developed, both the adult mammals born and raised on Earth, as astronaut explorers would be, and their children, as it were, born and raised on Mars. And it is a scandal that NASA has been in existence for over 66 years and has yet to fly a partial gravity experiment. And this is because the NASA health effects community is dominated by zero gravity health effects researchers, and that is why they have shunned artificial gravity research. But so there's research that could be done. But basically, look, anyone who has a child is taking a chance. Okay, your baby could be the next Hitler. Is that a reason to stop people from having children? The way we're going to find out if human beings can go to Mars and have children that develop properly is by someone daring to do it.
Great. But Steve, you've had a number of things in the chat. Do you want to say anything? And you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I shared that fascination with what Dr. Zubrin just shared, and in fact would potentially even be willing to fully fund or participate in funding a test of mammalian reproduction in space. But the simple idea would be, as you pointed out, over 20 years ago, just spin up a HAB in low Earth orbit to Martian gravity. I looked up guinea pigs have a 60-day gestation period. Impregnate them. You need rapid payload integration. Potentially a small launch vehicle could get you that, and then spin it up to Martian gravity and just have a webcam, see if you have a live birth. If you do, great. If you don't, it'll motivate further research. So you could do I think, a very quick and dirty analysis of this for less than $10 million. At least that's my personal point of view. As for the book, I also wrote that, put a link in there, a critique. I read it fully, enjoyed it very much, by the way. So thank you for writing it, first of all. I love a few summary points on it. One that I think we haven't talked about yet. One of the conclusions of the book is that of all the places that you could do in space, Mars sucks least. So while he takes goes through all the different parts of the solar system, this is my favorite part of the book.
You're not a Venus guy?
What's that? Yeah, we're not going to Venus, at least. Okay. Yeah, the upper atmosphere, what have you. But Mars sucks the least. And a colony, we can't assume everyone is a superhuman like Chris Hadfield. I thought that was humorous and interesting. I actually agree that mammalian reproduction should be studied. It's a travesty it doesn't. I think PETA actually has shut down a NASA mission. And when I talk to people in the small sat and small launch community, it's actually fear, believe it or not, fear of sacrificing some rats that prevents them from pursuing this, and they want to focus on a sample return mission from low Earth orbit, so you don't have that issue. It's absurd. If we can get past the protests, I'd love to see that happen. As for the book, one of my major critiques, I think you've heard it from others, but I would just double underscore, the book does go through some reasonable assessment of things that we need to think about: radiation, poisonous perchlorates, food production, but none of these feel like showstoppers to me. The most interesting one to me was the minimum efficient scale of a colony given specialized labor needs, or autarky, as I think you put it, Zach. And you think about that. If you only had 10 people, you don't have the specialization of labor, who's going to make semiconductors, who's going to make whatever. But I think the key challenge there also is we see the solution already, which is robots and the advances in robotic landing parties, which inevitably would be setting up systems for us to arrive to, as opposed to those colonies being all human to start. So I think I'm inherently more of an optimist, as maybe many would say. I'm curious, perhaps in the form of a question, if Zach has any further follow-up, having written the book, having heard the criticisms, on things like the overall likelihood or not likelihood of permanent human settlement on Mars being solvable within the next 10 years if human ingenuity and entrepreneurial effort was to be focused on it. So imagine, just as a thought experiment, Elon sends 5 starships to Mars in 2026, and a bunch of starships to Mars in 2028. Actually, it'd be early 29, I think, in the way the things line up. Does that motivate human ingenuity, humanoid robots? Clearly food, that's like the obvious one.
Yeah.
We're not going to grow cows on Mars, but we don't need to. We can get steaks other ways. So these issues has solutions. Now, radiation, structural issue to be addressed. But the question is just, have you rethought any of those? Do you net conclude, gosh, seems like a fool's errand? Or do you potentially say, gosh, no, this feels like an entrepreneurial challenge in the brave new world?
So real quick, there are some experiments by JAXA on multiple gravity regimes on rats being done. I haven't checked in what the latest data is, but there is work being done on it. And if the Mars Society is proposing that, I applaud it. It's the right step for reproduction. In terms of your question about robots, we're all bewildered by AI right now. It's certainly possible The thing I like to say, though, if we're entering a world where everyone can have 60 robot butlers, then I don't know what the urgency is about. This is something we're going to do when we're like a Star Trek-y civilization. And that's fine. I'm trying to go quickly, sorry, because I'm almost out of time. 10 years, I don't think so. For what you're talking about is a settlement. If you mean like a McMurdo-style base, by all means, it could be done. It would probably be fairly dangerous, but it certainly could be done. And I'm about to have to go, and I just wanted to mention one more response to a point Dr. Zubrin brought up, which was this concern that we have to get to space because we need to convince the world that resources are plentiful, so we don't go to war over resources. Please read, there's a book by Emily Meyerding called The Oil Wars Myth, where she argues, at least in the context of oil and plausibly in other contexts, nations do not go to war for resources and haven't since the First World War. The closest thing to an exception is maybe the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Nations fight over oil once they're in wars. The evidence that nations go to war over resources is scant. I don't think it's a strong argument. And
Okay,
I have
last
to go in 1 minute. Maybe I can answer one more question.
Yeah, last question is going to be, how can people contact you, find out more about you, help you?
My information is public. I'm just Zach at smbc-comics.com. Oh, I'm sorry. I have to go pick up my kids. Please email me if you think I'm totally off base. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you
so much.
Thanks.
Thank
Amen.
you.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate getting a little pushback. Usually the interviews are a little more, I don't know the right word. Okay, I'm sorry. My wife is waving at me. I got to go with my kids. Have a good one. Thank you all. And thank you to Dr. Zubrin for the questions and pushback. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bob. We'll coordinate offline. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one, y'all.